Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Xils Lab Xils 4 tutorial series. I'm going to have a look today at the keyboard panel. It's this large section at the bottom of the synthesizer. It contains lots of different configuration options to allow us to manipulate our interaction with the synthesizer. If you're enjoying this series so far and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. Awesome way to do that. I'm going to start today by having a look at the playing mode section. At the moment it's on mono. If I drop the list down, you can see the various options. We'll stick in mono for now. What I'm going to do is play a note. I'll play a C5. You see 523 Hertz. While I'm holding that down, I'm going to play a note one octave lower. Now I'm going to let that low note go, and we return immediately to the high note. Now I'm going to do the same configuration, but the other way around. I'll play the low note first. Now I'll play the high note. You don't hear it. You didn't hear that high note because at the moment note priority is set to low, which means it doesn't matter how many keys I play on the keyboard, you'll always hear the lowest note and only the lowest note. This is exclusive to mono, by the way. Priority has no significance when we're in polyphonic mode. Now I'm going to switch it to high and we'll get exactly the opposite behavior. Here's my high note, play the low note, you don't hear it. Other way around, low note first. Every time I press the high note, it overrides the low note, and that's the one you hear. By far my favourite of the options for priority modes, I almost always use last because musically it's the one I'm most interested in. It literally does exactly that. It doesn't matter whether the note is higher or lower, it's always the last note that you're going to hear. So, low note, there's the high note overriding. I'm going to let the low note go and then press it again because that was the last note that got played. That's the one we hear. And that means that you can solo in both directions and you'll always hear the last note, even if you either deliberately or inadvertently play legato. In other words, you've got two notes pressed down simultaneously. You can see me playing basically chords there, but you always hear the last note. Let's have a look what else we've got in this menu. Uni stands for unison. This basically means it's going to stack voices. The synthesizer is going to stack voices on top of each other. So you get a doubling effect. Basically the noise gets richer. So I'm going to play a single note. Can you hear there's immediately more tonal complexity there? You can also see it in the oscilloscope. Let's switch back to simple saw. That's what a simple sawtooth looks like. But in unison, got two notes playing simultaneously, but they're very slightly different. Now this is an analog synthesizer, so inherently everything is slightly offset against each other, and you're always going to get this kind of complex interaction between the two waves because no two waves in the analog world are ever absolutely identical. However, it is accentuated. I'm going to jump right over to the right hand side of the keyboard to have a look at this analog knob. Now at the moment this is set to detune, which basically means that the waves are deliberately detuned against each other. If I pull detune all the way down to 0, now the sound is simpler. It's still complex. As you can see, we've still got a non-standard sawtooth here, but a lot of that variance has been removed. As I introduce detune, then those two notes will move further apart again. And we can accentuate that effect further by introducing 4-voice and 6-voice mode. So obviously this is now going to be 6 different voices stacked on top of each other. For the most complex different waveforms, you can see that there's quite a lot of variance there. So all of these waves are playing against each other. Circular is the most CPU intensive. It's going to take, now we're not interested in the priority control anymore, that's got nothing to do with it, but the number of voices does. At the moment it happens to be set to 11, you can see there's a maximum of 18 here. So this is the total number of voices the synthesizer can ever reproduce at a single time. Now that's not necessarily just the number of keys that you've got pressed down, because if you have a long release cycle, then even though you might have let the key go, that note is still sounding, the synthesizer is still generating that tone. So there's lots to bear in mind when you consider the number of voices. If you, for instance, have some sort of arpeggio playing with lots of different notes playing very quickly, they all require their own voices. The way that circular poly works is that it uses the full array of 11 available voices in a kind of round robin fashion. So let's set myself up a little bit more release. If I play enough notes, what's basically going to happen is that they're all going to stack together. There was a brief moment in time there where I'd asked the synthesizer to generate more than 11 tones and it's not capable of doing it. So it throws away the oldest notes first and it does its best to play them all simultaneously. What happens with reset poly mode is that when I let a key go and press a new key, that new key will use voice number 1. If you imagine a priority stack, voice number 1 is the most important voice and they go down in descending importance order. So every time I press a new note, that note's going to use voice number 1, which means the maximum number of voices that ever sound simultaneously is the number of keys that I've got pressed down. And we no longer have this CPU burden issue where potentially all 11 voices are being used, but that is going to reduce the kind of the authentic integrity of the synthesizer, because a note could be in the middle of its release cycle fading out nicely. You press a new note on the keyboard and it's immediately truncated. Now bear in mind that this doesn't mean that every time you press a new note, the entire memory is purged. If I've got 2 notes playing simultaneously, I'm going to play a perfect fifth interval here. And while that chord is sounding, while that 2-note chord is sounding, I'll take my hands off the keyboard, play a 3rd note. The first note that I played is going to get thrown away, but the 2nd note of the original perfect fifth will retain. So here's 1 note, 2 notes, there's my 2-note chord. Now I'm going to play my higher note. So the low C's been thrown away. That was the first voice, the most important voice, which has now been overridden. But that 2nd voice is still allowed to ring out because that voice hasn't yet been stolen. So generally speaking, I'll have circular poly. That's not to say reset poly is completely useless, because it has a different sound. The notes are going to get truncated more readily, which means you're going to get a sharper, kind of clearer sound with, all of these release tails can kind of start falling over each other. Very musical decisions to be made, but just bear in mind that you've got 2 different options there. For today's purposes, because it's so much easier to demonstrate stuff in mono mode, I'll switch back to the simple one. The next feature I want to have a look at is in the keyboard matrix, because we have the ability to generate a second delayed signal. In addition to our standard on and gate pins, we have delayed versions of them. I'm going to activate both of those as well. And the delayed signal is controlled by this delay knob. So if I turn it to 12 o'clock, I'm going to press a single note on the keyboard, and you heard 2 different notes. If I pull that delay down a little bit, now I've basically got a very kind of crude slapback delay. Every note that I play is going to generate 2 different notes. Pretty straightforward what's going on there. Let's turn them back off again. Most of these pins on the right hand side are to deal with this this extended module on the right hand side of the synthesizer. We've not dealt with that yet, but we'll have a look back at the matrix when we come to deal with that in a later episode. The hold button does exactly that. Press a note down, it's just going to ring out until I play a new note, and the monophonic synthesizer kind of just basically decides what's going to be the next note that gets played. And the sync switch is tied to the delay control. So if I enable sync and hover over the delay, now you can see it's in multiples of the host tempo. Then we've got these low and high commands, which basically means which keys on the MIDI keyboard is the synthesizer going to respond to. So as you can see, you've got keyboard 1 and 2. You could split so that keyboard 1 responds to low keys, keyboard 2 responds to high keys, pretty straightforward. I don't believe this channel feature currently works. If I turn it to anything other than all, then playing notes on my keyboard, but it stopped responding. But to be absolutely honest with you, I don't care. Pretty much everything that I ever do on a synthesizer is all on an Omni MIDI channel anyway, and I'll use multiple tracks in my DAW if I want different messages to go to different instances. Let's jump over keyboard 2 and have a look at these controls on the right hand side. Key follow first. This is a pretty confusing control until you understand that it's basically a seesaw based around the C, middle C. Well, I say middle C, it's the C that's generated at 523 Hertz, this fella. Now you can see physically where it is on the keyboard. I'm going to call it C5 because there's various definitions of what C5 is. It doesn't really matter. It's the pitch at 523 Hertz. When I play that note and mess around with the key follow control, nothing's going to happen. So that's the center point around which the synthesizer is based. I'm going to set key follow back to 50%. Now I'm going to play a note one note lower than C5. So as I turn the knob down, the pitch goes up. Now I'll play a note one semitone higher. The pitch goes down. So that's the seesaw pivot around which key follow is tracking. In other words, the pitch offset that I'm going to have from this point gets steeper and steeper in opposite directions depending on whether you're above or below this point. So here's C an octave lower, going all the way up to a full octave above where we started, and an octave higher than C5. Again, shifting by an octave from 12 o'clock down to 0, from 50 down to 0. Obviously we've got two different key follow controls that respond to keyboard 1 and keyboard 2 in the advanced matrix. To the right of that we've got mod wheel, which is exactly the same kind of thing, but this time we're going to assign it to the mod wheel. So let's dive into our matrix. We'll map mod wheel to oscillator pitch, and with mod wheel turned all the way down, play a note. Turning my mod wheel up and down, no difference whatsoever. As I increase the control, now with the mod wheel all the way down, it's still not having any effect, but as I start increasing it, this amount of modulation, however much I've dialed in, is going to be added to the pitch of the note. Pitch bend range is pre-configured. This is our pitch bend wheel. It exists on pretty much every keyboard you come across. Play a note, turn my pitch bend up. So that's the maximum extent of the pitch bend wheel. Give me bigger range. Pretty straightforward. Next along we've got the velocity control. Obviously this is going to respond to how hard we hit the keyboard, and by default it's not mapped to anything, so it's not going to do anything. Let's have a look in the matrix. Here's our velocity mapping. The first demonstration I'm going to give you is to map it to the output level. So this is the master output level of the whole left-hand synthesizer. Turn velocity all the way down, press a quiet note, don't hear anything, as hard as I can, still don't hear anything because the velocity modulation isn't allowing any signal to get out. If I turn velocity all the way up to maximum, now a very quiet note, there we go, and a louder note, now we've got velocity control. But that's velocity control being applied to the entire synth simultaneously, all of your oscillators together. I'm going to take that connection away. Let's dive into the matrix so I can see a bit more clearly what's going on. Instead, I'm going to go into one of my extended commands into the oscillator, and I'm going to map it to oscillator 1's saw level and make a connection there instead. So now I'm directly affecting this control and only this control. So quiet note, louder note, but I'm only affecting this. If I now bring in a second oscillator in oscillator 2, that will be completely unaffected by velocity. Quiet note, loud note. So you can hear the sawtooth from oscillator 1 being superimposed over the top of those other two kind of volume stable sounds. So you need to decide what you want to configure your velocity for, but obviously that's the whole idea of a modular synth. all of the options available to you. Aftertouch next, same kind of thing, but this time it's how hard you press into the kind of the spongy bit on your keyboard, presuming you've got Aftertouch on your keyboard. I'll configure it for us now. So let's turn Aftertouch all the way up, and I'm going to press a key. You get no sound at all. Now I'm going to press into the Aftertouch, and there it is. So I've basically got control of the volume of the synthesizer by how far. I've got the key pressed down all the time. What I'm doing by making these sounds occur is pressing into the spongy bit of the Aftertouch zone. Left and right is not pan. Don't make the mistake of thinking it is. It's the mix between the left-hand side, the left-hand synth and the right-hand synth. Now at the moment we've only got a left-hand synth configured. I'm not going to plug a right-hand synth in just to show you that, but basically it's the mix between these two different synthesizers. We've got global tuning, so once again, this is both synths, the entire instrument has a global tuning option. Need to disengage my Aftertouch so that I can hear anything. We've already seen this analog knob basically detuning each of the voices of the synthesizer. Then we've got glide time. Let's turn Portamento back on. Right at the very beginning of the tutorial series, we had Portamento engaged. It's part of the standard initialized sound. So here we go. Now it doesn't matter how far apart, how in distance, in time I play those notes. So there's the low note and then a bit of a pause. The synthesizer behind the scenes remembers the last control voltage that was received from the keyboard, and it applies its portamento. If we engage legato, that will no longer be the case, and each individual note that I play will only play that note, and you'll only get a portamento if both notes are held down together. That's what legato is. So there's the low note, there's the high note, and you can decide whether or not you're going to introduce portamento during your solo by whether or not you lift your hand entirely off the keyboard at any point, in which case that's going to shut the portamento down, or you have that legato effect by making sure you've always got at least two keys played. Glissando splits the portamento up into individual semitones. Now, in order to hear this, I'm going to make the glide time much longer. You can hear each one of those distinct semitones. If you really push it, you'll hear, very distinct, like going up an escalator kind of thing. And over on the right hand side, global level is the master output level for the entire synthesizer. And very self-explanatory. That's the keyboard section covered. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit like. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.